Greetings, dear adventurers. Tonight we delve into the history of a creature that has haunted humanity's dreams for millennia, the vampire. Not the misunderstood romantics of recent memory, but the true, blood-soaked terrors that clawed their way out of ancient nightmares. Before we part ways on this journey, let me know where you're tuning in from. It would be most interesting to see all the corners of the world from which you gather. Now, with lights low, let's gently wander into tonight's story. Before we had the cape-wearing bloodsuckers everyone knows today, there were just whispers. Dark, unsettling whispers in the earliest days of recorded history. Long before anyone bothered to write anything down, mind you. We're talking about the Proto-Vampire Myth, the foundational dread that something out there would drain your life force. These weren't necessarily individuals with fangs and a disdain for sunlight. They were often malevolent spirits, reanimated corpses, or even grotesque entities of pure shadow. Think less of a charming nobleman and more, thing that crawls out of your nightmares and leaves you a desiccated husk across various nascent cultures. You'd find tales of entities like the Lamia in ancient Greece, a child devouring monster with the body of a serpent, or the Lilith of Mesopotamian and Hebrew folklore, a night demon preying on infants and men. These weren't vampires in the modern sense, but they shared the core predatory aspect. The crucial element here is that they didn't transform you, they just took. There was no grand curse, no eternal damnation to be bestowed. Just a very unpleasant, very final interaction. And honestly, for all the drama modern vampires inflict, at least these older entities were straightforward. You knew where you stood. Or rather, where you fell once they were done with you. No confusing emotional entanglements, just good old-fashioned terror. The fear wasn't of being turned into one of them. It was simply the fear of being consumed. These were the primal fears of a world that didn't understand disease, or sudden death, or why infants sometimes just stopped breathing. It was easier, and perhaps more comforting in a grim sort of way, to attribute such tragedies to a malevolent force. Oh, little Timmy died. Must have been the shadowy spirit that drinks the warmth from babes. Far less complex than, say, understanding basic hygiene. And of course, these early superstitions often involved crude preventative measures, like leaving sharp objects near the bed, or placing specific herbs on thresholds. Simple, direct, utterly ineffective, but it made people feel better. Which, let's be honest, is the primary function of most magical rituals. It's a peculiar thing, tracing these threads back. You see how the fear of the unknown slowly solidified into something more concrete. The vague terror of an unseen force began to take on a shape, albeit a shifting one. And this initial, formless dread is where all the subsequent nonsense about fangs and coffins truly began. It's like watching a particularly unpleasant seed sprout into a monstrous, but predictable weed. A shame, really. Some of the older horrors had a certain, understated elegance. Now it's all capes and theatrics. You just know these ancient proto-vampires would look at their descendants today and just shake their spectral heads. You call that terrifying? We used to just be terrifying. No elaborate backstory required. This deep-seated fear of vital essence being stolen is the bedrock upon which all subsequent vampire lore is built. It's the original, raw terror that slowly, over millennia, got embellished, politicized, and frankly, glamorized beyond all recognition. From these shadowy, formless threats, we slowly transition into more defined, more localized terrors, giving birth to the specific cultural manifestations that would eventually lead to the vampire as we recognize it. And believe me, it only gets more convoluted from here. So, as I was saying, the initial fear of life, draining entities was rather, shall we say, abstract. But as societies developed, as people started settling down and arguing about whose goat was whose, these amorphous fears began to coalesce. They took on specific shapes, specific names, and often surprisingly mundane origins. This is where we see the early cultural manifestations of what we now vaguely recognize as vampiric entities. And let me tell you, most of them were less sophisticated predator and more unpleasant consequence of poor burial practices. Consider the Akimu from ancient Mesopotamian lore. These weren't exactly elegant bloodsuckers. They were restless spirits of the unburied dead, or those who died violent deaths, returning to haunt the living. Their feeding wasn't through fangs, it was through causing disease, mental anguish, and generally making life miserable. A rather diffuse form of vampirism, if you ask me. More like a pervasive bad mood that slowly drains your will to live, rather than a dramatic neck-biting incident. And the solutions. Not stakes, but rather elaborate exorcism rituals and proper burial rites. Because apparently, even in death, some people just can't take a hint and stay put. Then you have the goal from Arabic folklore. Now, these are closer to what people might picture as monstrous. Often depicted as demonic beings inhabiting desolate places, particularly graveyards. They weren't after blood as much as they were after, well, fresh corpses. Or, if they were particularly peckish, travelers who wandered too close to their lairs. They're scavengers, not sophisticated predators. Honestly, the idea of a creature lurking in a graveyard, gnawing on bones, it's not exactly the epitome of terror, is it? More like a hygiene problem. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Before modern medicine, before refrigeration, what happened to bodies after death was often a messy, unpleasant business. It's no wonder people started imagining things that liked that sort of thing. Some of the most potent horrors are simply exaggerations of everyday unpleasantness. And let's not forget the strigoi from Romanian folklore, a term that's rather close to home, isn't it? These were often reanimated corpses, sometimes even living people with malevolent magical abilities who would drain the life from others. They could be responsible for crop failures, livestock deaths, and, of course, the wasting sickness of people. This is where we start seeing a slightly more direct link to the concept of vital essence being stolen. But still, the methods were varied, not always a direct blood-sucking. Sometimes it was just a general malaise, a creeping coldness that settled over a village. And the solutions? Well, digging up bodies and performing various unpleasant rituals, not for the faint of heart or those with sensitive noses. What's fascinating, and frankly a bit tiresome, is how these early fears are almost universally tied to things people didn't understand. Disease, famine, sudden death, and the decay of the body, all fertile ground for imagining a malevolent entity responsible. It's far easier to blame a mythical monster than to acknowledge the grim realities of a pre-scientific existence. These weren't grand, immortal aristocrats. They were often just the reanimated, unquiet dead, driven by a primal hunger born of their untimely demise or improper rest. And the methods for dealing with them were often crude, violent, and highly superstitious. It's important to remember that these entities were localized. A creature of dread in one village might be utterly unknown a few hills over. There was no grand, unifying vampiric empire at this stage, just isolated pockets of fear and very specific local monsters. They reflected the anxieties of that particular community, that particular time. They weren't global phenomena. They were very much a product of their limited horizons. And it's from this diverse, rather unglamorous collection of restless spirits and grave robbers that the more recognizable vampire would eventually emerge. We're moving, slowly, from the genuinely terrifying unknown to the well, to the Eastern European nightmare. Romania, and more precisely, Transylvania, became the infamous hotbed for vampiric activity. And frankly, it's where the concept of the vampire, as most people understand it, truly solidified. It stopped being just a local superstition and started becoming a genuine regional pestilence. Why here, you ask? Well, it's a delightful blend of isolation, superstition, and genuinely poor public health practices. The rugged terrain meant communities were often cut off, breeding insular beliefs and a deep-seated distrust of outsiders. Combine that with a prevalent belief in magic and the supernatural, and you have a perfect breeding ground for stories of the undead. Diseases like tuberculosis, with its pale skin, coughing of blood, and wasting away, often mimicked the symptoms of a vampiric attack. In the eyes of the uneducated, people were dying, and they wanted an explanation that wasn't poor sanitation or the weather, blaming a returning corpse. Much more dramatic. The concept of the strigoi and vampire truly blossomed here. These weren't just reanimated corpses. They were often seen as vengeful spirits of the dead who hadn't received proper burial rites, or those who were simply cursed. They'd return to torment their families, drain their vitality, cause illness in livestock, and generally be a blight on the community. And here's where we start getting into the really specific, and often gruesome, remedies. Villagers weren't just praying, they were acting. They were digging up graves, often based on flimsy evidence like an undigested meal in the stomach of a corpse, or a surprisingly fresh appearance. "Oh, look, Aunt Helga looks too good for someone who's been dead a week! Must be a vampire!" Never mind that the cold ground preserves bodies remarkably well. No, it had to be supernatural. This led to the infamous practices of staking, decapitation, and even burning suspected vampires. Imagine the scene: an entire village, gripped by fear, digging up a coffin in the dead of night, only to find a perfectly normal, albeit deceased human being, and then proceeding to brutalize the corpse. And then, of course, when the vampire was dealt with, and the illness eventually ran its course or moved to the next village, it was seen as proof that their methods worked. A self-fulfilling prophecy of fear and violence. You'd think after a few centuries of this, someone might have thought to try, I don't know, boiling their water. But no, more stakes? It was in this region that the lore became incredibly detailed. We see the emergence of specific vulnerabilities, the aversion to garlic, the crippling effect of holy symbols, the necessity of being invited into a home. These weren't universal truths from the elder days. They were practical, localized responses to a very specific, superstitious fear. Garlic, a common folk remedy for illness, became a ward against the creature that brought illness. Holy symbols. Well, if it's a demonic entity, of course, the sacred would repel it. These were not grand, overarching weaknesses. They were the practical superstitions of frightened peasants. The isolation of these communities meant that these stories and practices festered, evolving independently of external influences. They became deeply ingrained in the local psyche. When travelers finally did venture into these remote regions, they brought these chilling tales back to the more civilized parts of the world, often embellishing them along the way. And so, the Carpathian Mountains became synonymous with vampires, a reputation they still haven't shaken. Once the idea of the vampire gained some traction beyond isolated villages, it was only a matter of time before ambition and a rather pathetic human need for status warped the narrative. Suddenly, we weren't just dealing with nameless, shambling horrors. Oh no, now we had bloodlines and lineages with self-proclaimed, noble, vampire houses, complete with elaborate and usually entirely fabricated histories. It's truly astonishing how even the most monstrous of beings can't escape the human desire for a pecking order. These supposed noble houses would often claim ancient origins, tracing their transformation back to some powerful sorcerer, a dark deity, or even, ludicrously, a misbegotten branch of actual human royalty. The most famous example, of course, being the entirely unfounded claims linking certain vampiric clans to historical figures like Vlad Dracula. Now, don't get me wrong, Vlad was a brutal fellow, certainly fond of impaling people, but a vampire. Give me a break. He was just a particularly unpleasant warlord. The vampires, however, seized upon his reputation like a leech on a fresh wound, using his notoriety to bolster their own flimsy claims of ancient power and aristocratic pedigree. It's the ultimate form of magical identity theft. These noble vampires often presented themselves as refined, cultured individuals, living in crumbling castles and presiding over vast, desolate estates. They collected art, read ancient texts, probably upside down, knowing them, and generally put on airs of sophistication, all while still needing to periodically drain the life out of someone. It's like a perpetually starving art critic. They tried to elevate their monstrous nature into something grand and elegant, something earned. And of course, These invented genealogies served a purpose. They justified their perceived dominance over lesser creatures, thus including, naturally, humans and even over other, less pure-blooded vampires. The sheer snobbery of it all is truly breathtaking. Within these fabricated lineages, there were often elaborate rules of succession, internal feuds, and even vampiric marriages, presumably without the actual production of offspring. Unless you count more vampires, which I strongly advise against, they'd engage in intricate political maneuvers, vying for control over territories or access to prime feeding grounds. You'd think an immortal creature would find better things to do with eternity than squabble over who gets to drain the miller's daughter first. But no, the petty squabbles of humanity seem to translate perfectly into the immortal sphere, the concept of a pure blood. Vampire also emerged from this. These were supposedly the direct descendants of the first, vampires untainted by weaker bloodlines or, heaven forbid, human contamination. They were often depicted as possessing greater strength, speed, and more potent mental abilities. And of course, they were insufferably arrogant about it. I've met a few of these pure bloods. Most of them were just as dull and predictable as their lesser brethren, just with a slightly more inflated sense of self-importance, and a tendency to bore you to death before they even got to the draining part. This fascination with bloodlines also gave rise to the idea of a vampiric sire, the one who turned a human into a vampire. This created a chain of command, a hierarchical structure that lent itself well to the noble house narrative. The sire held power over their progeny, and the progeny, in turn, owed fealty. It's a rather tidy little system for ensuring perpetual subjugation, isn't it? And it allowed for the narrative of powerful, ancient progenitors pulling the strings from the shadows, an idea that always seems to appeal to those who like to feel insignificant. So, while the initial vampiric fears were about random chaotic monsters, the rise of bloodlines injected a dose of manufactured order and a hefty helping of aristocratic pretense. It's a testament to the human and, apparently, the vampiric capacity for self-delusion. And speaking of survival, let's talk about the most overblown vulnerability these creatures supposedly possess, the sun. Sunlight, the ultimate, undeniable weakness of the vampire, right? The golden rays that turn them to dust, leaving behind a pile of expensive cloaks and perhaps a dramatic groan. It's the most iconic image, isn't it? A vampire caught in the dawn, dissolving like a forgotten ice sculpture. And I must say, for all the dramatic flair, the reality of the sunlight debate among actual practitioners and, well, survivors is far more nuanced and frankly far less satisfyingly explosive. You see, the idea that all vampires instantly combust upon contact with sunlight is largely a romanticized exaggeration. It makes for excellent storytelling, of course. A dramatic chase scene culminating in a fiery demise is far more entertaining than, say, a vampire just feeling a bit peckish and slightly uncomfortable. But in truth, the effects of sunlight vary wildly, often depending on the age and purity of the vampire's lineage, that insufferable bloodline nonsense we just discussed. For the younger, newly turned vampires, direct, prolonged exposure to sunlight is indeed incredibly debilitating. It's not usually instant combustion, however. More often, it's a slow, agonizing process of desiccation and degradation. Their skin will blister and crack, their unnatural strength will rapidly wane, and they'll eventually crumble into a state of inert dust or a desiccated husk. Imagine a rather stubborn piece of old fruit slowly shriveling in the sun, but with more screaming. It's certainly a deterrent, but it's not the instant, dramatic pyrotechnics most people imagine. And frankly, they make such a fuss about it. You'd think they were dissolving instantly. The older, more ancient vampires, however, are a different story. These aren't creatures of instant dust. Their bodies, having existed for centuries, are often more resilient, more calcified, if you will. For them, sunlight is still a profound discomfort, causing severe pain and a drastic weakening of their powers. It can still kill them, given enough time and direct exposure, but it's a much slower, more arduous process. Think of it like a truly terrible sunburn that just keeps getting worse, coupled with a debilitating migraine and every muscle in your body seizing up. They don't typically burst into flames, they just become utterly miserable and vulnerable, which, for them, is probably worse than death. A creature of infinite vanity losing its unholy glow.
The horror!
This is why you rarely see ancient vampires strolling around in broad daylight. Not because they'll explode, but because they'll be reduced to a shadow of their power, vulnerable to even the most rudimentary attacks. They become effectively human in their frailty, which for them is an unbearable indignity. They rely on their speed, their strength, their charm, and their ability to terrify, strip that away, and they're just glorified pale people with an unfortunate aversion to daytime activities. The concept of daywalkers exists too, though they are exceedingly rare and often the result of unique magical circumstances, powerful artifacts, or exceedingly obscure rituals. These are not natural vampires, and even they usually pay a heavy price for their ability to withstand the sun, often losing other inherent vampiric traits, or being subject to other, equally unpleasant vulnerabilities. It's never a free ride with magic, especially not with dark magic. So, while the idea of sunlight being the ultimate kill switch is a delightful fantasy, the reality is more mundane. It's a crippling weakness, a severe impediment, but rarely the instant annihilation depicted in your dime store novels. They are creatures of the night, because the night is where they are strongest, safest, and most effective. It's not just an aversion, it's a strategic necessity for their survival. And honestly, it makes them rather predictable. You want to avoid a vampire. Don't go out after dark. Revolutionary, I know, but it works. Now, let's talk about the unsung heroes of vampire lore: garlic and silver. These are the go-towards, the peasant's last resort, the cheap and readily available deterrents. You drape garlic everywhere, brandish a silver cross, and voila! Instant vampire repellent. Or so the stories go. The truth of their efficacy, however, is a rather mixed bag, ranging from mild annoyance to actually quite effective, but for unexpected reasons. Let's start with garlic. The pungent bulb. Its strong odor is said to repel vampires, cause them discomfort, even burn them. The widely accepted theory behind garlic's effect is often linked to its historical use as a powerful medicinal herb, particularly for warding off illness and evil spirits. In times when diseases were attributed to malevolent forces, it made perfect sense that a strong-smelling, health-promoting plant would be effective against a creature associated with sickness and death. And indeed, for many lesser, newly turned or weaker vampires, the smell of garlic is profoundly irritating. It causes them discomfort, makes them nauseous, and can even temporarily weaken their resolve. Think of it less as a deadly poison and more as a particularly bad case of heartburn that lasts for hours. They simply find the odor offensive to their heightened senses. However, for an ancient, powerful vampire, a string of garlic is about as effective as a particularly loud sigh. They might find it mildly unpleasant, a nuisance, perhaps akin to having a mosquito buzz around your ear. But it's not going to stop them from ripping your throat out. I've seen a venerable elder vampire walk straight through a room festooned with enough garlic to ward off a small army, merely wrinkling its nose with a look of utter disdain. Such crude methods. It hissed before proceeding to do whatever it was going to do. It's a testament to human optimism, really, that we'd think a common kitchen ingredient could stop an immortal being of the night. It's a nice thought, though. Keeps the vegetable farmers in business. Now, silver. This is where things get a bit more interesting. Unlike garlic, which is mostly an irritant, silver does possess a genuine, if often misunderstood, effect on vampires. It's not usually a magical burn or a direct holy property, but rather a unique energetic resonance. Silver, in many cultures, is associated with purity, the moon, and has a certain alchemical property. For vampires, whose very existence is a perversion of natural life force, silver acts as a disruptive agent. It interferes with their unnatural regeneration, causing severe pain and preventing their rapid healing. A silver blade, for instance, won't just wound a vampire. It will inflict a wound that festers and refuses to close quickly. A silver bullet might not instantly kill them, unless it's in the heart, of course, but that's just good aim. But it will cause immense, prolonged suffering and potentially incapacitate them far more effectively than a conventional lead bullet. It's like a constant, agonizing splinter that prevents their magical healing from kicking in. This is why experienced vampire hunters often incorporate silver into their weaponry, not as a magical repellent, but as a practical tool for inflicting lasting damage. The effectiveness of holy symbols made of silver, such as a crucifix, often comes from a combination of these factors. The inherent anti-regenerative properties of the silver combined with the symbolic power of the holy object. If wielded by someone with genuine faith, that is, a disbeliever waving a silver cross is just waving a piece of metal. It's not the cross itself that burns them, but the silver disrupting their dark energies, amplified by the conviction of the wielder. I've seen devout priests repel far more powerful creatures with a simple silver locket than some fool with a chest full of garlic. So, while garlic is largely an urban legend propagated by farmers, silver holds a genuine, if not always instantly lethal, disruptive power. It's a useful tool, but no substitute for a well-placed stake or, indeed, a healthy dose of common sense. And speaking of what they prefer not to be on the receiving end of, let's delve into their actual dietary preferences, beyond just a casual neck nibble, because, trust me, it's not always as simple as a sip of blood. The core, the very essence, of what makes a vampire, well, a vampire. Most common folk imagine a swift, elegant bite to the neck, a polite slurp of crimson, and then off they go, leaving behind a bewildered, perhaps slightly anemic victim. If only it were that simple. The truth of what truly sustains these wretched creatures goes far beyond just a simple draught of blood, and frankly, it's far less palatable. Yes, blood is the primary fuel. It's the most potent, most immediate source of vital essence for them. Think of it as the refined fuel of their unlife. It provides the raw magical energy needed for their supernatural strength, speed, regeneration, and illusory charm. The fresher the blood, the better, for it carries a stronger, more vibrant life force. And human blood, particularly that of the young and vital, is generally considered the most potent. It's why they tend to gravitate towards populated areas despite the risks. They're not just looking for a meal, they're looking for quality. However, the act of feeding isn't always a quick, clean bite. For many vampires, especially the younger, less controlled ones, it can be a messy, brutal affair. They aren't always concerned with discretion. And some, the truly depraved, don't just stop at a single draught. They can drain a victim completely, leaving nothing but a desiccated shell. These are the ones who don't care about a sustainable food source. They're driven by a primal, insatiable hunger that overrides any pretense of control or nobility. And trust me, you don't want to be around when one of them decides it's time for a meal. It's not a pretty sight. But here's the often overlooked truth: while blood is essential, it's not always just blood. Many creatures of shadow, including certain types of vampires, also feed on vital energy, the very life force that animates living beings. This can be drawn in various ways, sometimes without a single drop of blood being shed. A vampire might drain the spark from a victim, leaving them weak, sickly, and utterly devoid of energy, even if their blood count remains ostensibly normal. This is why some victims of vampiric attacks seem to waste away mysteriously, succumbing to an unexplained malaise. Their physical bodies are intact, but their very will to live has been siphoned off. It's a far more insidious form of predation, and often harder to detect. Furthermore, some of the more esoteric or ancient vampires can feed on emotions. Fear, despair, even intense joy can provide a subtle, intoxicating nourishment for them. They might torment their victims, not just for the physical blood, but for the raw, potent emotional energy released by extreme terror or anguish. This is particularly true for psychic vampires, a rarer, more specialized breed that focuses almost entirely on the mental and emotional landscape of their prey. Imagine an eternal being who thrives on your misery. It's enough to make you want to invest in a very thick, lead-lined hat. And then there are the truly desperate or specialized cases. Some lesser vampires, when blood is scarce, might resort to feeding on animals, though this is considered far less nourishing and often leaves them weakened and prone to a more feral, bestial state. Others might even feed on decay or death energy, drawing sustenance from putrefaction and the fading echoes of life. These are usually the truly grotesque forms, the ones who lurk in crypts and thrive in graveyards, far from any semblance of human society. They are a stark reminder that vampirism is a curse, not a lifestyle choice. The type of feeding often dictates the type of vampire. The elegant, seductive ones prefer human blood, for it allows them to maintain their refined facade. The bestial ones, those driven purely by hunger, will take whatever they can get. And the truly ancient, truly powerful ones, they often have the luxury of choice, sometimes preferring the subtle, spiritual drain over the messy business of physical blood. It's a spectrum of depravity, you see. So, the next time you hear a bard sing of a vampire's eternal thirst, remember it's not always a simple matter of blood. It's a multifaceted, often disgusting, and deeply disturbing relationship with the very concept of life force. When people imagine vampiric societies, they often conjure images of grand covens, intricate hierarchies, and ancient vampire councils pulling the strings of the night. After all, what's more dramatic than an underground network of immortal rulers? The reality, however, is far less cohesive and often boils down to a rather pathetic scramble for resources and power. It's rarely grand cooperation, and more often, well, it's like trying to herd 1,000 particularly grumpy, perpetually hungry cats. The vast majority of vampires operate as isolated predators. This is particularly true for the younger, less experienced, or those turned by accident or circumstance rather than by design. They are driven by an immediate, desperate hunger, and their focus is purely on survival and individual sustenance. They don't seek out others of their kind. In fact, they often avoid them, viewing them as competition for dwindling food sources. These solitary creatures often lead brutal, short-run lives, constantly on the run from hunters or, just as likely, from more powerful vampires. Their society is simply the shadow they cast as they move from one victim to the next. However, the concept of covens or clans does exist, particularly among the older, more established vampires. These aren't always benevolent or cooperative alliances. More often, they are pragmatic arrangements born out of a need for mutual protection, shared hunting grounds, or a desire for control over specific territories. A coven might consist of a powerful elder, the sire or progenitor, and their direct progeny, forming a twisted familial unit bound by blood, both the shared vampiric kind and the blood they consume together. These groups can be incredibly insular and fiercely protective of their own. Outsiders, whether human or other vampires, are generally met with suspicion, if not outright hostility. The structure within these covens is rarely democratic. It's almost always a rigid hierarchy based on age, power, and often sheer brutality. The older the vampire, the more powerful they generally are, and thus the more authority they wield. Disobeying an elder in a coven is usually a swift path to a rather unpleasant, final death. These covens might establish rules for their territory, dictating who can feed where, how discreetly they must operate, and how to deal with human authorities or hunters. But these rules are often enforced through fear and violence, rather than any genuine sense of camaraderie. True vampire nations or widespread, unified societies are exceedingly rare, bordering on mythical. The inherent nature of vampirism, the insatiable hunger, the predatory instinct, the immense pride and paranoia that comes with immortality makes large-scale cooperation incredibly difficult. Imagine trying to get 100 top predators, each convinced of their own superiority, to agree on anything for more than 5 minutes. It invariably devolves into backstabbing, power plays, and often open warfare. I've seen more, Grand vampire alliances collapse under the weight of their own egos. Then I've had decent cups of tea. And that's saying something. What might appear as a society to an outsider is often just a loose collection of powerful individuals who temporarily tolerate each other for strategic advantage. They might form temporary alliances to combat a common enemies, like a particularly effective guild of hunters, or to exploit a new feeding ground. But these are alliances of convenience, not genuine unity. The moment the threat is gone, or the resource exploited, the knives or fangs are often back out. There are, of course, urban legends of hidden cities, of vampires, secret courts, and grand underground metropolises where they live in elaborate luxury. And while some very ancient, very powerful vampires might maintain secret strongholds with a retinue of lesser thralls and human servants, these are exceptions, not the rule. Most vampires are far too preoccupied with the immediate needs of survival and feeding to bother with building elaborate social structures. It's all about the hunt, the feed, and avoiding the rather inconvenient final death. So, while the idea of a vast, unseen vampire empire is certainly captivating, the reality is far more mundane, a scattering of isolated, self-serving predators, with occasional pockets of grudging cooperation amongst the more powerful and ancient ones. Everyone talks about the gift of immortality, don't they? The endless years, the accumulated knowledge, the ability to watch civilizations rise and fall. Sounds rather grand, doesn't it? But for the vampire, it's often referred to, quite accurately, as the immortality curse. Because an unending existence, particularly one predicated on consuming the life force of others, comes with a truly debilitating psychological toll. And it's not always the dramatic madness you see in the melodramas. Often, it's something far more insidious. Firstly, there's the sheer boredom. Imagine living for centuries. You've seen everything, heard everything, done everything. The initial thrill of newfound power and endless time quickly fades, replaced by a crushing ennui. What's the point of anything when you've already experienced it 100 times over? Learning new languages, mastering obscure arts, collecting rare artifacts, these pursuits lose their luster when you have an eternity to complete them and no genuine sense of accomplishment to be gained. Most ancient vampires fall into routines, rigid and monotonous, simply to give their endless nights some semblance of structure. It's like being perpetually stuck in a particularly dull committee meeting that never ever ends. Then there's the profound loneliness. Vampires, by their nature, are separated from humanity. They cannot truly integrate, cannot form lasting, genuine bonds without the constant specter of their true nature hovering over every interaction. Those they care about will age, sicken, and die, while they remain unchanged. This leads to an emotional detachment, a deliberate hardening of the heart to prevent the unbearable pain of perpetual loss. They might take human lovers or companions, but these relationships are always finite from the vampire's perspective. It's like befriending a particularly interesting mayfly. You know it's not going to last, so why bother getting truly invested? This emotional isolation leads many to a deep-seated melancholy, a quiet despair that even the freshest blood can't truly assuage. Next, consider the accumulation of guilt and trauma. Every life taken, every family shattered, every act of violence committed over centuries weighs on the soul, no matter how much a vampire tries to rationalize it. Some might become utterly sociopathic, devoid of empathy, but even then, the cold, hard facts of their existence remain. Others are tormented by their past deeds, leading to self-loathing and a desperate longing for an end that rarely comes. Imagine reliving every mistake, every atrocity, for hundreds of years. It's enough to drive anyone mad, and for many vampires it does. This often manifests as erratic behavior, sudden bursts of rage, or long periods of catatonic despair. I've seen more than one ancient vampire simply sit in the dark for decades, utterly unresponsive, consumed by the sheer weight of their past. Finally, there's the loss of identity. Over centuries, memories fade, experiences blur, and the human being they once were slowly erodes. They become something else entirely, a being defined by its monstrous hunger and its endless unlife. The dreams, aspirations, and relationships of their former existence become distant echoes, eventually vanishing altogether. This can lead to a profound existential crisis, a feeling of being utterly adrift in time, without a true anchor or purpose. They are no longer human, but they are also not truly alive in the way a natural creature is. They are merely existing. This psychological decay is often why ancient vampires are either incredibly powerful and terrifyingly focused, having transcended or suppressed these feelings, or they are utterly broken, mad shells of their former selves. The wise elder vampire is often just the one who has managed to compartmentalize their madness most effectively. The curse of immortality is not just about being undead. It's about being perpetually isolated, bored, and haunted by an endless parade of increasingly meaningless yesterdays. Given that vampires need humans to survive for sustenance, for servants, for the occasional dramatic monologue audience, their relationship with humanity is, predictably, complicated. It ranges wildly from outright, brutal prey to rather uneasy alliances, and everything in between. And honestly, it often depends entirely on the vampire's personal disposition, their age, and how much they value discretion over a good, messy meal. At the most basic level, humans are food, pure and simple. For the vast majority of vampires, particularly the younger, less controlled, or feral ones, humans are merely livestock, a walking, breathing blood bag. Their interactions are brief, violent, and utterly devoid of empathy. These vampires don't bother with charm or subtlety. They hunt, they feed, and they move on. This is the oldest, most primal form of human-vampire interaction, and it's the one that fuels most of the fear and the legends. When a vampire acts purely as a predator, there is no relationship, only consumption. However, as vampires grow older and, theoretically, wiser, they often realize that unrestrained slaughter is counterproductive. It draws attention, riles up the local populace, and invites the attention of pesky hunters. Thus, many learn to become more discreet, more subtle. They might choose victims carefully, feeding just enough to sustain themselves without killing, or preying on those who won't be missed. This leads to the concept of controlled predation, where humans are still prey, but managed like a herd of cattle, ensuring a continuous supply. It's a coldly utilitarian approach, devoid of malice, but also of any true connection. Then we enter the murky waters of manipulation and servitude. Some vampires, particularly the more powerful and intelligent ones, don't just feed, they exert influence. They might enthrall humans through their powers of compulsion, turning them into loyal, unwitting servants or even thralls who willingly offer their blood. These human thralls often believe they are serving a powerful, benevolent master, or are simply caught in a web of dark fascination. This creates a deeply imbalanced relationship, where the human is little more than a tool, a resource, or a toy for the vampire's amusement. These relationships are often tragic, ending in betrayal or the inevitable death of the human. But the most fascinating, and often dangerous, dynamic is the uneasy alliance. These are rare, often born out of necessity when a common threat emerges, perhaps a powerful human hunting guild, a rival supernatural faction, or an external magical force. In such cases, vampires might grudgingly work alongside humans, forming temporary pacts or sharing information. These alliances are always fraught with tension, suspicion, and the ever-present danger of betrayal. Both sides know the other is a potential enemy once the immediate threat is gone. It's a dance on a knife's edge, where the rules are constantly shifting, and a single misstep can be fatal. I've seen more than a few of these alliances end with one side attempting to backstab the other, usually with predictable results. Never trust a vampire with an offer of cooperation. They usually just want to know where your veins are. And finally, there are the truly rare, almost mythical instances of genuine connection. These are aberrations, often involving a vampire who, through sheer force of will or a unique circumstance, manages to overcome their predatory nature enough to form a bond with a human that transcends mere utility. These relationships are often tragic, doomed from the start by the vampire's nature and the human's mortality. They are the stuff of bardic tales, often embellished beyond recognition, because the truth is too grim. Such connections usually end in heartbreak, or the vampire simply disappearing when the burden becomes too great. So, while the nature of the relationship varies wildly, the underlying truth remains: humans are, for the most part, a resource. Whether that resource is exploited brutally, subtly, or in a temporary truce, the inherent power imbalance and the fundamental difference in their natures make true equality, or even genuine trust, nearly impossible. And speaking of differences, let's delve into the truly bizarre side of things, because not all bloodsuckers are created equal. Some are just weirder. Most people think of a vampire, and they picture the classic elegant, pale, a bit dramatic, and always keen on a neck. But the truth is, the magical world is teeming with various forms of parasitic undead, each with its own peculiar habits, weaknesses, and levels of utter nastiness. These are the lesser-known breeds, the obscure and often far more grotesque variants that even seasoned hunters might not recognize. And believe me, some of them make your typical fanged fiend look like a charming dinner guest. First, let's talk about the Jiangshi, or hopping vampires, from the Far East. Now, these aren't the seductive charmers you're thinking of. They are reanimated corpses, stiff with rigor mortis, that move by hopping with their arms outstretched. Their skin is often greenish, mottled with decay, and they sport long, sharp claws. They're often blind and detect victims by their breath, which is why a common folk remedy involves holding your breath and standing perfectly still. Their feeding isn't always through blood. They often drain the ki, or life force, directly from a living being, leaving them weakened and susceptible to illness. Imagine trying to explain to a European hunter that the thing draining the village's vitality looks like a dried up old man in a traditional robe, hopping towards them, utterly bewildering. Then there are the grave ghouls. While some ghouls merely feast on decaying flesh, theirs, as we briefly touched upon, a particular, more vampiric strain exists. These are often created when a human, driven by an unholy hunger, consumes the flesh of the dead, gradually transforming into a monstrous, emaciated creature that craves fresh life. They don't have the typical fangs. Instead, their mouths are often distended, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth, and their skin is tough and leathery. They are less about elegance and more about raw, desperate hunger. They'll drain their victims through open wounds, or simply by gnawing at them until the life force and blood is gone. They are the epitome of decay and desperation, often smelling faintly of the grave itself, not the sort you'd invite to tea. Consider also the psychic vampires. These are arguably the most insidious, because they don't even need to touch you. They feed entirely on your emotional and mental energy. They might be incredibly charismatic, manipulative individuals who subtly drain the vitality from those around them, leaving their victims feeling constantly exhausted, depressed, and devoid of motivation. They latch onto strong emotions, fear, anger, obsession, despair, and literally feast upon them. You could be in a room with one for hours, feeling increasingly drained, and never even realize you're being preyed upon. There are no fangs, no blood, just a creeping sense of weariness that never quite goes away. These are often the true masters of subtle manipulation, using their feeding to control others without them ever knowing. And let's not forget the dampers. Though they are not vampires themselves, they are a fascinating variant. These are the offspring of a vampire and a human, often possessing some of the vampire's strength and speed, but without the full curse of vampirism, and sometimes with an innate ability to sense or even harm true vampires. They exist in a liminal space, often hunted by both humans and vampires, never truly belonging to either world. They are the ultimate biological paradox, a living testament to an unholy union. Finally, there are the truly ancient, truly mutated forms, the ones that have existed for so long and fed on such strange things that they barely resemble their original vampiric form. Some are amorphous, shadowy beings that absorb life through mere proximity. Others are crystalline, drawing energy from light or sound. These are thankfully rare, often bound to ancient ruins or forgotten places, but when they emerge, they defy all conventional understanding of vampiric weaknesses. They are the eldritch horrors that lurk at the edges of the known magical world, reminding us that even the familiar can become terrifyingly alien. So, the next time you think you know what a vampire is, remember this: the darkness holds far more variations than your simple superstitions account for. And sometimes, the most dangerous ones aren't the ones you can stake. So, if you have a population of predatory undead that insist on feasting on the living, it stands to reason that the living would eventually organize to do something about it. Enter the hunters' guilds. The brave, the bold, the utterly foolhardy individuals who dedicate their lives to eradicating vampires. You'd imagine them as grand organizations with ancient secrets and infallible methods, wouldn't you? The reality is often far grittier, more desperate, and frankly, a good deal bloodier. Historically, hunters' guilds weren't always formal organizations. More often, they started as desperate village mobs, driven by fear and armed with pitchforks, torches, and a healthy dose of superstition. Their methods were brutal, often indiscriminate, and just as likely to result in the death of an innocent or a slightly eccentric old woman as a genuine vampire. These early attempts were largely futile against anything but the weakest, most newly turned, or most foolish of vampires. An enraged mob can achieve a lot, but coordinated, long-term vampire eradication, not so much. As the understanding of vampires grew, or at least the specific superstitions solidified, more dedicated individuals and groups began to emerge. These were often religious orders, sworn to fight the unnatural, or secretive families who had suffered at the hands of the undead for generations. They began to accumulate knowledge, develop specialized tools, the well-known stakes, holy water, blessed blades, and, of course, the ever-useful silver. These groups were often small, highly specialized, and operated in the shadows, knowing full well that drawing too much attention meant becoming targets themselves. Their successes were usually isolated, focusing on one vampire or one small coven at a time. It was a war of attrition, fought in the dark, with very high casualties on the human side. The most effective guilds aren't always about brute force. They rely heavily on intelligence gathering. Knowing a vampire's habits, its preferred feeding grounds, its vulnerabilities as beyond the common law, and its human thralls is far more important than just having a sharp piece of wood. They often employ a network of informants, delve into ancient texts, and even develop crude methods of tracking the movements of these creatures. A well-placed bit of information can be worth a dozen brave but clueless individuals, and sometimes these hunters are forced to form those uneasy alliances with other supernatural entities, or even with less dangerous vampires to fight a greater threat. Desperate times, as they say, call for desperate measures. However, the major hurdle for most hunters' guilds is the sheer longevity and cunning of their prey. A human hunter lives a finite life, accumulates knowledge over decades, and then eventually dies. A vampire lives for centuries, accumulating knowledge, perfecting its methods, and learning from every encounter. It's a wildly unfair fight. Many guilds have been utterly annihilated by a single, ancient vampire who simply waited them out, or systematically hunted them down one by one. The history of vampire hunting is littered with the bones of well-intentioned but ultimately outmatched individuals. And let's not forget the internal struggles within the guilds themselves. Secrecy breeds paranoia, and the constant exposure to darkness can lead to madness or corruption. Some hunters become so obsessed with their prey that they begin to resemble them, adopting their methods, their ruthlessness. Others simply burn out, succumbing to fear, exhaustion, or the grim realization that their fight is endless. It's not a glamorous life, no matter what the bards sing. Despite the odds, these guilds, in their various forms, persist. They are the thin, often broken, line between humanity and utter vampiric dominance. Their successes, though rare, prevent outbreaks, disrupt coven plans, and occasionally, just occasionally, manage to put an end to a truly ancient and dangerous fiend. It's a thankless task, ensuring that most people remain blissfully unaware of the horrors that stalk the night. And speaking of how these horrors have changed, let's cast our gaze to the present. You'd think a creature that thrives on ancient ways and dark shadows would simply wither in an age of flickering lights and constant surveillance, wouldn't you? Well, you'd be wrong. Modern vampirism isn't about grand castles and isolated villages anymore. It's about adaptation, discretion, and finding new ways to be an absolute pest in the current age of magical decline. And honestly, some of their new habits are just lazy. The most significant change is, of course, the widespread presence of electricity and urban sprawl. Gone are the days when a vampire could simply stalk a moonlit road, knowing that anyone out after dark was fair game. Now, every city is a blaze of electric light, every street corner has a lamp, and cameras are, annoyingly, everywhere. This forces vampires to be far more subtle. They can't just burst into a home without attracting attention. This has led to a greater reliance on charm, compulsion, and infiltration. Many modern vampires blend seamlessly into high society, leveraging their ancient wealth, or what's left of it, and their unnerving charisma to gain access to exclusive circles where victims are plentiful and disappearances are less scrutinized. Think less ghastly monster, and more charming, slightly unsettling billionaire with odd hours. Another major adaptation is in feeding methods. The direct, brutal drain is still common for the less sophisticated, but for those who value longevity and discretion, new methods have emerged. Some establish elaborate networks of human thralls who willingly offer blood, perhaps under the delusion that they are part of some exclusive club, or simply ensnared by powerful compulsions. Others might operate in the shadows of hospitals or morgues, tapping into blood banks, though this is considered incredibly low-grade sustenance by purists. There are even rumors of vampires developing synthetic blood alternatives, though these are largely unproven and highly controversial within their own hidden communities, as most ancient vampires consider it an affront to their very nature. Imagine a vampire drinking synthetic blood. The indignity. It's like a connoisseur being forced to drink dishwater. The rise of global travel has also changed things. Vampires are no longer confined to their ancient, dreary homelands. A powerful vampire can now traverse continents in a single night, thanks to hidden magical pathways or, more mundanely, private jets. This allows them to escape localized threats, establish new hunting grounds, and spread their influence across the globe. This also means that what might be considered a regional vulnerability in, say, Transylvania, might be utterly irrelevant in a modern metropolis halfway across the world. A hunter relying on old superstitions is going to find themselves sorely outmatched. Perhaps most ironically, the decline of widespread magical belief works in their favor. In an age dominated by science and reason, people are far more likely to attribute strange deaths to mundane causes, a sudden illness, a criminal act, a bizarre accident rather than the supernatural. This skepticism shield allows vampires to operate with a degree of impunity they never had in the truly superstitious ages. Who would believe a wild tale of a blood-drinking monster when a more rational explanation is available? It's a rather convenient side effect of humanity's self-proclaimed enlightenment. However, this modern age also brings new challenges for them. Information spreads quickly. A single sighting, a single mistake can be reported and shared globally in an instant. This makes large-scale coven operations riskier than ever. And while many hunters are outdated, some have adapted, using modern surveillance techniques, digital forensics, and global networks to track their prey. It's a constant, silent war between ancient predators adapting to a new world and modern hunters learning ancient tricks. So, while the image of the vampire might remain tied to dusty crypts and Gothic castles, the reality is that many of them are navigating the same brightly lit, fast-paced world we are. But for all their cunning and ancient wisdom, There's one thing they still haven't managed to pull off, and believe me, many have tried. It's the ultimate fantasy for the accursed, and the ultimate frustration for those who foolishly believe in it. The holy grail for any vampire who despises their eternal unlife, or for any lovesick human who foolishly believes their undead parama can be saved. You hear whispers of it, don't you? Ancient rituals, rare elixirs, a conveniently forgotten loophole in the original curse. Let me disabuse you of this notion right now, the cure. Fallacy is one of the most enduring and dangerously misleading myths surrounding vampirism, and the reason attempts to reverse the vampiric condition almost always fail is because vampirism isn't just a disease. It's a fundamental alteration of being, a perversion of life itself. Firstly, most so-called cures are simply elaborate cons perpetrated by other, more cunning supernatural entities, or by charlatan mortals looking to exploit the desperate. They promise salvation, usually for a hefty price in coin, or more likely in lives. I've seen more than one foolish vampire stripped of their remaining power, or worse, utterly destroyed by attempting some ancient ritual, peddled by a demon in disguise. It's a tragic tale, really. Almost funny if it didn't involve so much unnecessary screaming. The core problem is this vampirism, in its purest form, isn't a magical malady that can be reversed by a counter spell. It's a fundamental change in the very fabric of one's existence. When a human becomes a vampire, their soul is often altered, twisted, or even partially severed from its natural connection to the cycle of life and death. Their very biological processes are rewired. Blood becomes a source of vital energy, not just a life fluid, and their body ceases to decay. You can't just rewire something that's been fundamentally changed at a magical and spiritual level with a simple potion. It's like trying to turn a stone back into sand by wishing really hard. There have been incredibly rare, almost legendary, instances of a vampire reverting to a semblance of humanity. But these are usually the result of unique, cataclysmic magical events, a powerful cosmic convergence, a direct intervention by a deity which is exceedingly rare, as most deities have better things to do than babysit vampires, or a sacrifice of immense magical power from another source. And even then, the cure is rarely complete. The individual might regain their mortality, but they are often left with permanent physical scars, psychological trauma, or a lifespan drastically shortened by the unnatural strain their body endured. They are not simply human again. They are forever changed by what they were. Consider the cure, often involving the destruction of the original sire. The idea is that if the source of the curse is removed, the curse itself will unravel. And while destroying the sire can sometimes weaken their progeny, severing their connection to the original magical chain, it rarely results in a complete reversal of the vampiric condition. At best, it might render them vulnerable to new forms of attacks, or perhaps accelerate their eventual decay into dust. But it doesn't give them back their beating heart or their ability to walk in the sun without discomfort. Some desperate vampires have sought out artifacts of immense power, believing that an item imbued with primordial life force could counteract their curse. And while such artifacts can have temporary effects, perhaps allowing a vampire to experience fleeting moments of warmth or light, they invariably revert to their cursed state once the artifact's influence is removed. It's like a temporary reprieve from an eternal sentence, not a pardon. The closest thing to a cure that actually functions consistently is, ironically, the final death itself. A stake through the heart, decapitation, or prolonged exposure to severe sun can certainly end the vampiric condition. But it also ends the vampire, which, for most, defeats the purpose of seeking a cure in the first place. So, for all the desperate attempts, the cure remains largely a phantom, a cruel hope dangled before those who lament their monstrous existence. It's a stark reminder that some magical transformations are simply irreversible, a permanent damnation rather than a temporary affliction. So, after all this talk of their weaknesses, their internal squabbles, their pathetic attempts at aristocracy, and their surprisingly tedious existence, You might be thinking, well, can't we just get rid of them? A noble thought, certainly. And many have tried. But the unfortunate truth, the grim reality, is that the eternal threat of vampirism means they will likely never truly vanish from the world. It's an inconvenient, persistent pestilence, much like a particularly stubborn magical fungus. Firstly, their sheer resilience is astounding. A vampire isn't just a physical being, it's a creature imbued with dark magic, sustained by unnatural forces. Even if a stake to the heart or decapitation works on most of them, there are always exceptions, always those rare, ancient ones who have developed resistances or possess unique methods of corporealizing. And consider the sheer difficulty of finding all of them. They are masters of concealment, adept at blending into human society, or lurking in forgotten corners of the world where no sane person would venture. Trying to eradicate every single vampire is like trying to catch every single drop of rain in a storm, utterly futile. Then there's the method of their creation. Vampirism is a curse that spreads through an act of predation. As long as there are vampires feeding on humans, there will always be the risk of new vampires being created. It's a self-perpetuating cycle. You might eliminate a coven, but if one of their victims was turned and managed to escape, the problem simply propagates elsewhere. It's a hydra, cutting off one head only for another, or two, to sprout in its place. And given the sheer volume of humanity, there will always be a fresh supply of potential victims, and thus, potential new additions to their miserable ranks. Furthermore, the allure of vampirism, however twisted, remains for some. Power, immortality, heightened senses, these are tempting promises, even if the reality is far grimmier. There will always be misguided mortals who actively seek out the transformation, either driven by ambition, a desire to escape mortality, or simply a profound misunderstanding of what vampirism truly entails. These willing supplicants ensure a continuous stream of new recruits, whether through dark rituals or simply by presenting themselves to existing vampires. It's truly baffling the length some people will go to simply to be an eternal blood-drinking bore. Consider also the interconnectedness of the magical world. Vampires don't exist in a vacuum. They are often entwined with other supernatural entities, some even more powerful and ancient than themselves. Demons might create them, dark sorcerers might empower them, and malevolent deities might simply tolerate their existence as part of the natural order of imbalance. Eradicating vampires would often mean disturbing a much larger, more dangerous ecosystem of dark forces, an act that could unleash far worse horrors upon the world. Sometimes the devil, as they say, is preferable to the one you don't. Finally, there's the human element itself. As long as there is fear, superstition, and a fascination with the dark, the idea of the vampire will persist in the collective consciousness. Even if every single physical vampire were somehow eliminated tomorrow, the concept of the vampire, the fear of the blood-sucking night creature, would remain. And in the magical world, belief itself has power. What is feared and believed in deeply enough has a way of manifesting. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of dread. So, while hunters will continue their grim work, and mortals will continue to tell their cautionaries, or, more often, wildly romanticized tales, the vampire, in one form or another, is here to stay. They are a permanent fixture of the supernatural landscape, a grim reminder that not all darkness can be banished. They will continue to lurk in the shadows, sip their blood, and occasionally burst into a dramatic monologue, probably still complaining about the lack of decent sustenance. And perhaps that's just how the world is meant to be. Now, if you'll excuse me, all this talk of blood and endless unlife has made me rather sleepy.